The funny thing about a $500 fine is how lightweight it feels when it's printed on standard, flimsy copy paper and secured to your garage door with a single piece of blue painter's tape. You'd think financial extortion would have a bit more heft to it. I stood there in the suffocating July humidity of Cary, North Carolina, staring at this piece of paper while the beautiful, dark slate-stamped concrete of my brand-new driveway cured under the morning sun. The concrete wasn't even fully dry yet. The tape was still fresh. But there it was. A citation from the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association for unapproved masonry aesthetics. $500. Compounding daily until the offending structure was removed and replaced with HOA Standard Approved Pour Number 4. I didn't even know there were 4 different types of approved pours, let alone that I had chosen the nuclear option of driveway designs. I crumpled the paper in my fist. A memory from literally less than 24 hours ago flashed through my mind, playing out like a brightly lit tragedy. I had been standing in this exact spot, holding a mug of coffee, watching my contractor, Mike, orchestrate a fleet of cement mixers. Mike was a grizzled, no-nonsense guy who looked like he chewed gravel for breakfast and washed it down with black motor oil. He wiped sweat off his forehead with the back of a calloused hand and squinted at me. "You sure you don't need a permit from the HOA overlords for this shade of gray, Dave?" Mike had asked, his voice a gravelly rumble over the idle of the heavy machinery. "I've worked in Cary for 15 years. I've seen these people go to absolute war over a mailbox that was painted a slightly too aggressive shade of yellow." I had laughed. I actually, genuinely laughed. "Mike, come on," I had said, taking a sip of my coffee. "I'm just replacing the cracked 30-year-old concrete that was already here. I'm upgrading the property value. It's a driveway, not a moat. What are they going to do, complain that it looks too nice?" Mike had just stared at me, his eyes dead and devoid of any optimism. "They're an HOA, Dave. They don't need a reason. They just need a target." He wasn't wrong. God, he wasn't wrong. I looked down at the crumpled citation, then back at my driveway. It was glorious. It was meant to look like seamless slate stone, a deep, rich charcoal that perfectly complemented the brick exterior of the house. It was a masterpiece of modern suburban engineering. And Brenda, the president of the Whispering Pines HOA, wanted me to jackhammer it into dust. I didn't even go inside to put on real shoes. I stayed in my grass-stained New Balance sneakers, shoved the crumpled paper into the pocket of my gym shorts, and started marching down the perfectly edged, aggressively manicured sidewalks of my neighborhood. Whispering Pines was the kind of place where every blade of grass looked like it was measured with a ruler, and every shrub was pruned into absolute submission. It was a monument to conformity. Brenda lived 3 streets over in a house that looked exactly like mine, except hers had a flagpole displaying an American flag and a secondary, slightly smaller flag featuring a golden retriever. I didn't bother knocking. I just hammered the doorbell 3 times in rapid succession. The door swung open, and there she was. Brenda. She was clutching a clipboard like it was a shield, wearing a pastel yellow cardigan despite the 90-degree heat, and sporting a smile that didn't even come close to reaching her eyes. It was the kind of fake customer service smile that instantly triggers a fight-or-flight response. "Dave," she chirped, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "To what do I owe the pleasure? Did you get the welcome packet for the summer block party?" "I got a packet, Brenda, but it wasn't very welcoming," I said, pulling the crumpled citation from my pocket and smoothing it out on my leg. "Care to explain why I'm being fined $500 for a driveway that isn't even dry yet?" Brenda's fake smile tightened. She adjusted her grip on her clipboard. "Ah, the concrete. Yes. Well, Dave, as you know, we live in a society here in Whispering Pines. We have standards, guidelines, rules that keep our property values robust and our community aesthetically harmonious." "Aesthetically harmonious?" I repeated, tasting the corporate jargon on my tongue. Brenda, it's gray concrete. It looks like stone. It is slate-textured, charcoal-pigmented masonry, Dave, she countered, her voice dropping an octave into her official dictator tone. It is not HOA standard-approved pour number 4, which is a classic, unpigmented, brushed cement. If we let you have stamped concrete, what's next? People painting their houses neon pink? Raising livestock in their backyards? Parking recreational vehicles in the street? We have to nip these architectural rebellions in the bud. It's a driveway, I said, my voice rising slightly. My old driveway looked like a fault line. I fixed it. I made it better. You made it unauthorized, Brenda corrected, tapping her pen against her clipboard. And the bylaws are very clear. Section 4, paragraph 12, subsection C, explicitly states that any external masonry modification must be submitted in triplicate to the Architectural Review Committee 30 days prior to the commencement of labor. You didn't do that, Dave, because I didn't think I needed permission to fix a safety hazard on my own property. It's not just your property, Dave. It's part of the Whispering Pines tapestry, she said, looking past me at my sneakers. The fine is $500. It compounds every 24 hours. If the unauthorized structure is not removed and replaced by Friday, the board will have no choice but to place a lien on your property. We don't want to do that, of course, but our hands are tied by the bylaws. I stared at her. She was actually serious. She was going to try and steal my house over a shade of gray. I felt a hot spike of pure, unadulterated rage hit the back of my neck, but I forced my face into a blank, deadpan mask. A lien. By Friday, I said quietly. Rules are rules, Dave, Brenda said, offering that terrifying, lifeless smile one more time. Have a blessed day. She shut the door in my face. I stood on her perfect, approved porch for a solid minute, listening to the gentle hum of her central air conditioning. I didn't yell. I didn't punch the door. I just turned around and walked back to my house. The anger was still there, but it was coalescing into something much more dangerous. Absolute, hyper-focused spite. By the time I reached my own unapproved slate-textured driveway, I had made a decision. I was not paying a single dime to Brenda or her fake government. I wasn't going to tear up the concrete. I wasn't going to hire a lawyer to write a strongly worded letter. Playing nice was off the table. Trying to reason with a brick wall was off the table. I needed a weapon. A legal nuclear weapon that would burn the Whispering Pines HOA to the ground. I went inside, locked the door, and opened my laptop. The clock on the wall said 10 a.m. I opened a new tab, cracked my knuckles, and navigated straight to the Wake County Register of Deeds online database. If Brenda wanted to play by the book, I was going to read every single word in that book until I found a typo. I pulled up the original covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the CC&Rs, for the Whispering Pines subdivision. It was a massive 90-page PDF scanned from original typewritten documents from the early 90s. I spent the next 6 hours buried in legalese. I read about fence heights, mailbox regulations, grass species requirements, and acceptable window treatment colors. It was mind-numbing. It was a masterclass in micromanagement. By 4 p.m., my eyes were bleeding, I had a headache splitting my skull, and I hadn't found a single loophole. The bylaws were watertight. Brenda had the legal right to fine me, and she had the legal right to put a lien on my house. I slammed the laptop shut and rubbed my eyes. Was I really going to have to pay Mike to come back and destroy a $10,000 driveway? The thought made me physically sick. I reopened the laptop. I couldn't give up. Not yet. I pivoted my search away from the HOA bylaws and started looking at North Carolina state property laws. There had to be something. A superior state law that trumped local neighborhood covenants. I started typing frantic, obscure queries into the search bar. HOA limitations North Carolina. Restrictive covenant expiration. How to dissolve an HOA. And then, at 11:42 p.m., Fueled by 3 energy drinks and pure spite, I found it. It was buried in a dense, boring legal journal about property title management, but the words jumped off the screen like they were written in neon. The North Carolina Real Property Marketable Title Act, MRTA. I started reading. I read it twice. I read it a third time, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I could feel it in my throat. The MRTA was an obscure piece of legislation designed to clear up old, outdated claims on property titles. Essentially, the state didn't want houses tied up in 100-year-old contracts that no one remembered. So, the law stated that any restrictive covenants placed on a piece of property, like, say, an HOA's CC&Rs, automatically expired after 30 years. There was a catch, of course. The HOA could prevent the expiration, but they had to hold a community vote, legally renew the covenants, and explicitly re-record that renewal with the County Register of Deeds before the 30-year mark hit. I pulled up the Wake County tax records for my house. Year built, 1993. I looked at the date on my computer screen. 2026. That was 33 years ago. My hands were actually shaking as I flipped back to the Wake County Register of Deeds database. I searched for any document filed by the Whispering Pines HOA between 2020 and today. I looked for renewals, amendments, extensions, anything. 0 results found. I sat back in my chair, staring at the glowing screen in the dark room. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding, and a slow, manic grin spread across my face. Brenda was so obsessed with measuring grass height and policing driveway aesthetics that she had completely forgotten to do her actual administrative job. She had forgotten to file the paperwork. Legally, according to the state of North Carolina, the restrictive covenants binding my property to the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association had evaporated 3 years ago. The HOA had 0 authority over my land. I wasn't just exempt from the driveway rule. I was exempt from all of it. My property was completely unencumbered. I was no longer a resident of a governed subdivision. I was, for all legal intents and purposes, a sovereign entity sitting right in the middle of a neighborhood that didn't know it was defunct. I looked at the crumpled $500 citation sitting on my desk. I wasn't just going to get out of the fine. I was going to send a message that would echo through the perfectly manicured streets of this neighborhood for eternity. I was going to weaponize my newfound property rights in the most spectacular, obnoxious way possible. I picked up my phone and dialed a number. It rang 4 times before a groggy, annoyed voice answered. "Dave, it's midnight," Mike said, his voice thick with sleep. "Unless your house is actively sliding into a sinkhole, this better be good." "Mike," I said, my voice practically vibrating with excitement. "I need you to come back to the house tomorrow morning. We're not tearing up the concrete." "Good," Mike grunted, "because I wasn't going to do it anyway." "I have a new project for you," I continued. "I need you to build something else, something custom." "What is it?" "I need a boom barrier, Mike, like the ones they use at airport parking garages, and a heavy-duty toll booth. I need them installed at the absolute edge of my property line, right where the driveway meets the street." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. "Dave," Mike finally said, his voice slow and careful, "you live in a cul-de-sac." "Not anymore, Mike," I said, leaning back and looking out the window at my beautiful, unapproved driveway glowing under the streetlights. "I live in an independent republic, and border security is going to be my top priority." Mike showed up the next morning at 7 a.m. sharp, his diesel truck rumbling so loud I'm pretty sure it rattled Brenda's fine china 3 blocks over. I mean, he stepped out of the cab holding a battered thermos, looking at me like I had completely lost my grip on reality. Which, honestly, I kind of had, but in the best way possible. I was standing at the end of the driveway with a tape measure, wearing a high-visibility orange reflective vest I found in my garage, just to set the tone. "All right, Dave," Mike said, taking a slow sip from his thermos. "I'm here. You said boom barrier. You said toll booth. I thought maybe you were just drunk on power and energy drinks last night, but the vest is telling me you're actually serious." "I am literally so serious, Mike," I said, grinning like an absolute lunatic. I pulled the printed copy of the North Carolina Marketable Title Act out of my pocket and slapped it onto the hood of his truck. "Read it and weep. The HOA is defunct. My property is officially a sovereign nation. And like any self-respecting nation, I need to secure my borders against foreign invaders, namely Brenda." Mike picked up the paper. He read the highlighted section. Then he read it again. I watched his face transition from annoyance to confusion to a slow, creeping realization of the absolute chaos I was about to unleash. A raspy chuckle bubbled up from his chest, turning into a full-blown, gravelly laugh. "You found a loophole," Mike said, looking at me with what I can only describe as profound respect. "You actually nuked the HOA. Legally evaporated them," I corrected. "Now, about my border." Mike rubbed his chin. "Well, I mean, I can't pour a toll booth foundation today, but I got a buddy who does commercial parking lot liquidations down in Raleigh. He's probably got a mechanized gate arm sitting in his scrapyard right now. As for the booth, honestly, we could run over to Home Depot, grab one of those heavy-duty prefab wooden sheds, cut a window in it, and bolt it to the concrete." "Do it," I said, pulling out my credit card. "I don't care what it costs. I want it looking as aggressively bureaucratic as humanly possible." The rest of the morning was an absolute blur of glorious, unhinged construction. Mike made a few phone calls, and within 2 hours, a flatbed truck pulled into my cul-de-sac, carrying a slightly dented but fully functional red and white striped mechanical boom barrier. While Mike and his crew were wiring the motor to my garage's electrical panel, I was on my hands and knees with a roller, painting a thick, 4-inch wide Department of Transportation grade yellow line straight across the threshold of my property, exactly where my driveway met the city-owned asphalt of the street. I mean, neighbors were definitely staring. Mrs. Gable from next door was peering through her blinds like she was watching a hostage situation. I just waved at her. By 2 p.m. it was finished. And honestly, it was a masterpiece. Right at the edge of my pristine, charcoal-stamped concrete sat a heavy-duty mechanical gate blocking entry. Next to it was a 6x6 wooden shed, painted a sterile government gray. Mike had sawed a perfect square out of the side and installed a sliding plexiglass window. Inside, I had set up a folding chair, a space heater, a clipboard, and a little bell. But the piece de resistance was the signage. I had run to a custom print shop on my lunch break. Zip-tied to the boom barrier was a massive reflective metal sign that read, "Warning, you are now leaving the United States. Welcome to the Republic of Dave. Stop for Customs and Border Patrol. All HOA officials subject to search, seizure, and import tariffs. Violators will be trespassed." Mike stood back, wiping grease off his hands, and admired our work. "Dave, I've built a lot of things in my life. Luxury patios, retaining walls, outdoor kitchens. But this is my magnum opus." "You're an artist, Mike," I said, stepping into my toll booth and sliding the plexiglass window open and shut a few times. "I guess now we just wait for the enemy to make a move." We didn't have to wait long. At exactly 4:15 p.m., a silver Honda Odyssey turned into the cul-de-sac. It parked on the street, and out stepped Cary. Cary was the vice president of the Whispering Pines HOA, which basically meant he was Brenda's personal lapdog. He was a small, nervous man who always wore khaki shorts that were slightly too long and polo shirts tucked in way too tight. He was clutching a clipboard and a roll of blue painter's tape. I knew exactly what he was holding. Day 2's compounding $500 fine. I gave Mike a look. Mike just grinned, leaned against his truck and crossed his arms. I stepped into my toll booth, sat in the folding chair, and slid the window shut. Cary marched up the sidewalk, his eyes fixed on the ground. He didn't even look up until his shins were about 2 inches away from the yellow borderline. He stopped. He blinked. He looked at the thick yellow paint, then up at the red and white boom barrier blocking his path to my garage. He looked at the giant metal sign. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He took a hesitant step forward, raising his foot over the yellow line. I hit the button I had wired to the desk. Bzzz. A loud, obnoxious buzzer rang out, followed by the heavy clunk of the gate arm locking into place. Cary jumped back like he had been electrocuted. He looked around wildly, finally locking eyes with me sitting inside my gray wooden box. I slid the plexiglass window open with a sharp clack. "Good afternoon, traveler," I said, keeping my voice entirely flat, channeling my inner DMV employee. "Welcome to the Republic of Dave. State your business." Cary just stared at me. "Dave, what is this?" "This is an international border checkpoint, sir. You are attempting to cross into sovereign territory. I need to see a passport or a recognized government ID, and I need you to declare any agricultural products, firearms, or unauthorized neighborhood association documentation." "Dave, stop playing games," Cary squeaked, his voice cracking. He held up the clipboard. "Brenda sent me. You didn't cure the violation. The fine is now $1,000. I have to tape this to your door." "Ah," I said, nodding slowly. "I see you are attempting to import foreign legal decrees into the Republic. That's highly regulated. I'm going to have to ask you to step back behind the yellow line, sir. You are currently loitering in the demilitarized zone." "Dave, I'm just trying to do my job," Cary whined, taking a step closer, his toe crossing the yellow paint. "Sir, this is your final warning," I barked, leaning out the window. "You are illegally crossing a sovereign border. I am authorized to enact defensive measures." "What defensive measures?" Cary yelled, flustered, waving the citation in the air. I picked up the hose I had attached to the side of the booth and squeezed the nozzle. A quick, sharp blast of cold water hit Cary square in the chest. He shrieked, an actual high-pitched shriek, and stumbled backwards onto the asphalt, dropping his clipboard. Mike let out a bark of laughter from behind his truck. "Sir, you have been repelled from the border," I announced, perfectly deadpan. "If you wish to apply for a temporary visa, you may do so at this window. However, there is a $500 administrative processing fee, payable in cash, and a strict embargo on all HOA-related paperwork. Any attempt to smuggle Whispering Pines propaganda across this border will result in immediate seizure of the contraband and permanent deportation." Cary stood there, dripping wet, staring at me like I was a literal demon summoned from the depths of hell. His khaki shorts were soaked. He looked down at the citation, which was now floating in a puddle on the street, the ink bleeding into a blue, illegible mess. Brenda's going to hear about this," Cary stammered, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You let Brenda know that the Republic of Dave does not negotiate with terrorists," I said. I reached out and slammed the plexiglass window shut. Cary stood there for another 10 seconds, completely frozen, before he scrambled to pick up his clipboard, practically ran back to his minivan, and peeled out of the cul-de-sac. Mike walked over to the toll booth, wiping tears of laughter from his eyes. "Dave," he wheezed, "I would have done this job for free if I knew I was going to get dinner theater." "It's not over," I said, looking down the street where Gary's van had disappeared. "That was just the scout. The general is going to show up next, and she's going to bring an army. I wasn't wrong. Honestly, I didn't even have time to eat lunch before the real chaos started. It was roughly 5:30 p.m. The neighborhood was starting to wake up. People were getting home from work, pulling into their driveways, and subsequently stopping dead in their tracks to stare at the militarized checkpoint erected at the end of my property. I was sitting in my folding chair, eating a sandwich, when I saw the flashing yellow lights. A heavy-duty flatbed tow truck was rumbling down the street, followed closely by a white Ford Explorer with green security decals plastered on the side, and finally Brenda's pristine white Lexus SUV. This was it. The escalation. They parked in a disorganized clump in front of my house, blocking the street. Brenda marched out of her Lexus, and she wasn't wearing her pastel cardigan anymore. She was wearing a tailored blazer. She meant business. Following behind her was the tow truck driver, a massive guy with a beard who looked incredibly confused, and a private security guard who looked like he was about 19 years old and definitely regretting picking up this shift. Brenda stomped right up to the yellow line, stopping just short of it, her chest heaving. She glared at the boom barrier, glared at the sign, and then locked her terrifying, beady eyes on me inside the booth. I took a bite of my sandwich, chewed slowly, and slid the window open. "Can I help you, ma'am?" I asked. "Are you here to apply for a tourist visa? Because I have to warn you, our approval process is highly selective." "Cut the crap, Dave," Brenda hissed, her voice vibrating with pure, unadulterated fury. "I don't know what kind of psychotic breakdown you are experiencing, but you have exactly 5 minutes to dismantle this illegal barricade, or I am having it forcibly removed and towed at your expense. Then, I am calling the police to have you arrested for building code violations and assaulting an HOA officer with a garden hose." I wiped my mouth with a napkin. "Well, Brenda, like I told your subordinate, you have no jurisdiction here. This barrier is located entirely on my private property. And since the Whispering Pines HOA covenants expired 3 years ago due to your administrative negligence under the North Carolina Marketable Title Act, you are currently standing in the street screaming at a private citizen who owes you absolutely nothing." Brenda blinked. For a split second, I saw a flicker of confusion behind her eyes, followed immediately by aggressive denial. "Nice try, Dave. I don't know what fake internet law you Googled, but the covenants are permanent. Now take down the gate." She turned to the tow truck driver. "Hook it up. Rip it out of the ground." The tow truck driver looked at the gate, looked at me, and rubbed the back of his neck. Lady, I don't know. This looks bolted into the concrete, and it's behind his property line. If I rip that out, it's destruction of private property. I'm just here to tow unauthorized vehicles." "I am the president of this HOA!" Brenda shrieked, losing whatever tiny shred of composure she had left. "I am authorizing you! Do it!" The driver took a step back, holding his hands up. "Yeah, no, I'm not getting sued over a neighborhood dispute. Call me if someone parks in a fire lane." He turned around, climbed back into his cab, and drove off, leaving Brenda screaming after him. She whipped around to face the teenage security guard. "You! Arrest him!" The kid looked terrified. "Ma'am, I observe and report. I don't arrest people. I don't even have handcuffs. I have a flashlight." Brenda let out a sound that was half scream, half growl. She reached into her blazer, pulled out her phone, and dialed 911. "Fine, we'll do this the hard way. I'm calling the real police." "Please do," I said, leaning my elbows on the windowsill. "In fact, tell them to hurry. The loitering outside my border is really bringing down my property value." Honestly, the wait for the police was probably the most entertaining 20 minutes of my entire life. Brenda paced back and forth on the asphalt, right at the edge of my yellow boundary line, looking like a very angry, severely dehydrated flamingo in a tailored blazer. She was furiously typing on her phone, her thumbs flying across the screen. I guarantee you she was updating the private Whispering Pines Facebook group, probably labeling me as a domestic terrorist or something. The teenager in the green security polo was literally just standing by his Ford Explorer, staring at his phone, looking like he was desperately texting his mom to come pick him up. I mean, the whole street had basically turned into an impromptu block party. Mrs. Gable from next door had actually dragged a folding lawn chair out onto her front lawn and was sipping from a massive glass of iced tea, watching the whole thing like it was primetime television. A guy from 3 houses down, I think his name was Frank, though I'd never actually spoken to him before today, was standing on the sidewalk in cargo shorts, cracking roasted peanuts and tossing the shells into the gutter. It was wild. Honestly, it was the most genuine community engagement this neighborhood had seen in a decade, and all it took was one guy declaring a sovereign nation in his driveway. I just sat in my little gray toll booth, the space heater mercifully turned off, and a small desk fan pointed at my face. I opened a bag of chips and ate them slowly, making sure to chew loudly every time Brenda glared in my direction. Finally, a Cary Police Department cruiser turned the corner into the cul-de-sac. It didn't have its sirens on, but the light bar was flashing lazily, casting red and blue reflections across Brenda's aggressive white Lexus. The cruiser parked right in the middle of the street, and two officers stepped out. One was a tall, older guy with graying hair and a posture that just screamed exhaustion. The other was younger, maybe late 20s, with his thumbs hooked into his duty belt. Before they had even fully closed their car doors, Brenda was on them. She practically sprinted across the street, waving her clipboard in the air like a weapon. "Officers, thank God you're here!" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the brick facades of the surrounding houses. "You need to arrest this man immediately. He is violating multiple municipal codes. He has illegally barricaded a residential thoroughfare. He assaulted my vice president with a high-pressure water hose, and he is refusing to comply with legally binding homeowners association directives." The older cop held up a hand, wincing slightly at the volume of her voice. "Okay, ma'am, let's just take a breath. Calm down. Who exactly are we talking about here?" Brenda spun around and pointed a trembling, manicured finger straight at my toll booth. "Him! Dave! He thinks he's his own country! He built a toll booth! A toll booth, officer, in Whispering Pines!" The two cops looked past Brenda. They looked at the heavy-duty boom barrier. They looked at the thick yellow line painted on the ground. They read the giant, reflective metal sign declaring the Republic of Dave. Then they looked at me, sitting inside the gray wooden box, eating a potato chip. I gave them a polite, friendly wave. The older officer sighed. It was a deep, soul-weary sigh that came from the very bottom of his boots. He adjusted his radio mic on his shoulder and started walking slowly toward the yellow line, his partner trailing a few steps behind. Brenda marched right beside him, acting like she was leading a SWAT team into a compound. "Sir, are you Dave?" the older officer asked, stopping right at the edge of the painted yellow boundary. He looked completely unamused, but there was a glimmer of absolute bewilderment in his eyes. I slid the plexiglass window open. "I am, officer. Good evening. Welcome to the border. How can I help you gentlemen today?" "Right," the officer said, scrubbing a hand over his face. "So, dispatch got a call about a disturbance, an illegal structure, and an assault with a garden hose. Care to explain what exactly is going on here?" "He's a menace!" Brenda interjected, practically vibrating with rage. "He poured unapproved concrete. He owes the association over $1,000 in compounding fines. You need to make him tear this down and take him to jail." The officer gave Brenda a look that could have frozen water. "Ma'am, I need you to step back and let me conduct my investigation. If you interrupt me again, I will have you wait in your vehicle." Brenda's mouth snapped shut. She looked like she had just been slapped, but she took one angry step backward, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "Thank you," the officer said, turning back to me. "Okay, Dave, start talking. What is the deal with the toll booth?" "Well, officer, it's quite simple," I said, keeping my voice calm, reasonable, and entirely professional. "I am currently on my own private property. That boom barrier is bolted entirely into the concrete pad of my driveway, completely within my property lines. The yellow line demarcates the exact boundary where my deed ends and the city easement begins. As for the HOA, well, that's where things get interesting." I reached under my little folding table and pulled out the weapon I had prepared earlier that afternoon. It was a thick, black, 3-ring binder. I had gone to an office supply store and had the documents printed on high-quality paper, placed in plastic sheet protectors, and neatly separated with color-coded tabs. I slid the binder through the plexiglass window and handed it to the officer. "What's this?" he asked, taking the heavy binder. That, officer, is a certified, date-stamped copy of the original Whispering Pines restrictive covenants from the Wake County Register of Deeds, I explained, leaning back in my chair. It's tabbed to page 42. You'll also find a printed copy of the North Carolina Real Property Marketable Title Act, specifically Chapter 47B of the General Statutes, tabbed in red. The younger cop leaned over his partner's shoulder, raising an eyebrow. Marketable Title Act? Yes, sir, I said, unable to keep a tiny, smug smile off my face. As I'm sure you know, under North Carolina state law, HOA restrictive covenants expire automatically after 30 years unless they are formally renewed and re-recorded by a vote of the neighborhood. Whispering Pines was incorporated 33 years ago. The HOA board, under the current leadership of Brenda here, failed to file the renewal paperwork. Brenda let out a sharp gasp. That is a lie. That is internet nonsense. You can't just uninvent the HOA. I didn't uninvent it, Brenda. You just forgot to do your paperwork, I said smoothly. I looked back at the officers. Gentlemen, legally speaking, the Whispering Pines HOA has been entirely defunct and dissolved for 3 years. Every single house in this subdivision is now unencumbered property. They have no legal authority to issue fines, enforce aesthetic guidelines, or dictate what I build on my land. Since I am no longer part of their association, I decided to formally declare my property an independent entity. Hence, the border checkpoint. The older officer stared at me. He opened the binder. He read the first tab. Then he flipped to the red tab and read the statute. He stood there in the fading evening light for a solid 3 minutes, reading in total silence. The only sound was the rustle of the plastic sheet protectors and the distant hum of Mrs. Gable's air conditioning unit. Slowly, the officer closed the binder. He handed it back to me through the window. Then he turned to face Brenda. "Ma'am," he said, his voice flat. "Did your association file a renewal of your CC&Rs with the county prior to the 30-year expiration date?" Brenda looked like a deer caught in the headlights of a semi-truck. The bylaws are permanent. They are written into the fabric of the community. I don't have to answer to some obscure loophole." "That's not an answer, ma'am," the younger cop chimed in, suddenly looking incredibly amused. "Did you file the paperwork or not?" "It shouldn't matter," Brenda screamed, completely losing her mind. "He built a toll booth? It's an eyesore. It's bringing down the property values. Arrest him." "I can't do that, ma'am," the older officer said firmly. "He is on his own private property. He hasn't built on the city street or the right-of-way. As for your HOA rules, this gentleman has provided documented proof that your covenants are legally extinguished. This is a civil matter. If you want to argue the validity of his property rights, you have to do it in a courtroom, not on a sidewalk. The police department does not enforce expired neighborhood bylaws." "You have to do something," Brenda demanded, her voice cracking. "He sprayed Cary with a hose." The officer looked at me. I just shrugged. "Cary attempted to illegally cross an international border and smuggle invalid financial penalties onto my property, officer. I deployed a non-lethal, water-based deterrent to repel the intruder. He wasn't injured. He just got damp." The younger officer actually snorted, having to turn around and pretend to cough into his fist to hide his laughter. "Right," the older officer said, fighting a smile himself. "Well, since Cary isn't here to press charges and there are no visible injuries, I'm going to consider that a civil dispute as well." He took a step back, adjusting his belt. "Dave, keep the water hose holstered, all right?" "Understood, sir," I said, giving him a salute. The officer turned back to Brenda, whose face was now a dangerous shade of magenta. "Ma'am, it is time for you to go home. You have no legal authority over this property. If you step over that yellow line, he can have you formally trespassed, and then I will have to arrest you. Do you understand?" "This is an outrage!" Brenda shrieked. "I am calling the mayor. I am calling my lawyer. You haven't seen the last of this, Dave. I will ruin you." She spun around on her heel, stomped back to her Lexus, slammed the door so hard I thought the glass would shatter, and sped off down the street, blowing through the stop sign at the end of the block. The older officer sighed again, shaking his head. He looked at the teenager in the security polo, who was still standing by his Ford Explorer. "Son, you can go home too. The battle's over." The kid nodded rapidly, jumped into his car, and drove away without a word. The officers walked back to their cruiser. Before getting in, the younger cop looked back at my booth, grinned, and gave me a thumbs up. I watched their taillights disappear around the corner. The street was quiet for a second. Then, Frank, the guy in the cargo shorts from down the street, started clapping. Slowly at first, then louder. Mrs. Gable raised her glass of iced tea in my direction. I reached under my desk, pulled out the battery-powered megaphone I had bought on Amazon the day before, and clicked the microphone on. Bzz, zzz, zzz, tea. "Attention residents of Wake County," my voice boomed out over the cul-de-sac, echoing off the houses. "Brenda's visa application to enter the Republic of Dave has officially been denied. Thank you for your cooperation." I clicked the megaphone off, slid the window shut, and leaned back in my chair. Honestly, I felt like a king, but I knew the war wasn't over. Brenda wasn't the type to just accept defeat. She was going to drag this out. She was going to try and bankrupt me with legal fees. And she did exactly that. It took exactly 14 days for the process server to show up at my border checkpoint. I mean, the guy actually walked up to the yellow line, looked at the boom barrier, laughed out loud, and just tossed the thick manila envelope over the gate onto my stamped concrete. I had been officially sued in Wake County Civil Court by the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. The lawsuit was a masterpiece of desperate, unhinged legal fiction. They were suing me for breach of contract, unauthorized architectural modifications, creating a public nuisance, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and something called visual blight. They were demanding the immediate removal of the gate, the immediate destruction of the concrete driveway, $50,000 in punitive damages, and a permanent injunction against me ever modifying the exterior of my house without board approval. Brenda had hired a guy named Sterling. William Sterling, Esquire. I looked him up. He was one of those high-priced, slick-haired real estate litigators from downtown Raleigh who charged $500 an hour just to look at an email. Brenda was absolutely draining the HOA's reserve funds to fund this vendetta. She was gambling the neighborhood's roof repair money on trying to destroy my driveway. I could have hired a lawyer. I had the money, but honestly, where was the fun in that? If I hired a lawyer, they would just talk in hushed voices in judges' chambers and file boring motions to dismiss. I didn't want boring. I wanted a public spectacle. I wanted to represent myself. Pro se. Just me, my 3-ring binder, and the undeniable power of state law. The court date was set for late September. I spent the next 6 weeks prepping. I didn't just read the MRTA statute. I memorized it. I read case law. I read precedent regarding defunct corporate entities in North Carolina. I essentially turned my toll booth into a legal research library. I even installed a mini fridge in there so I wouldn't have to go back to the house for drinks. Every day, I sat in my booth, guarding my border, reading legal briefs. When the day of the trial finally arrived, I put on my best navy blue suit. I didn't want to look like a crazy sovereign citizen in court. I wanted to look like a completely reasonable, rational adult who just happened to own a toll booth. The Wake County Courthouse was a massive, imposing glass and steel building. I walked into courtroom 4B, carrying nothing but my trusty black binder. Brenda was already there, sitting at the plaintiff's table. She was wearing a severely cut black power suit and glaring daggers at me. Next to her sat William Sterling. He looked exactly like his headshot. Slicked back hair, expensive tailored suit, gold watch, and an expression of pure, condensed arrogance. He didn't even look at me when I sat down at the defense table. He was busy organizing a massive stack of folders, probably containing hundreds of pages of case law about fence heights and paint colors. The bailiff called the room to order, and Judge Harrison walked in. She was an older woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She sat down, adjusted her glasses, and looked at the docket. "All right," Judge Harrison said, her voice echoing through the microphone. "Case number 26, CV 4982. Whispering Pines Homeowners Association versus David. Well, just Dave. The plaintiff is seeking injunctive relief and damages regarding unauthorized property modifications. Mr. Sterling, I see you are representing the plaintiff, and the defendant is appearing pro se?" "I am, Your Honor," I said, standing up respectfully. Judge Harrison gave me a long, calculating look. "Are you sure about that, son? The law is complicated, and Mr. Sterling is an experienced litigator. You are entirely within your rights to request a continuance to secure counsel." "I appreciate that, Your Honor," I replied. "But the law in this specific matter is actually quite simple. I am fully prepared to proceed." "Very well," she said, leaning back. "Mr. Sterling, you may begin your opening statement." Sterling stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and strolled over to the podium. He spent the next 20 minutes painting me as a menace to civilized society. He talked about the sanctity of the neighborhood contract. He talked about how I had brazenly and maliciously defied the aesthetic guidelines that kept property values high. He went into excruciating detail about the visual horror of my red and white boom barrier. He even brought a projector and threw a massive high-definition photo of my toll booth up on the courtroom wall. "Your Honor," Sterling concluded, his voice dripping with dramatic flair, "this man has turned a peaceful, harmonious suburban cul-de-sac into a militarized zone. He has assaulted association officers. He has flouted the rules that he agreed to when he purchased the property. If you allow this flagrant violation of restrictive covenants to stand, it will set a dangerous precedent that will unravel the very fabric of community living in this county. We ask that you order the immediate demolition of the unauthorized structures and award damages to make the association whole." He sat down, looking incredibly smug. Brenda was practically vibrating with vindication, nodding along to everything he said. Judge Harrison turned to me. "All right, Dave, it's your turn. What do you have to say to these allegations?" I stood up, picked up my black binder, and walked slowly to the podium. I didn't have a projector. I didn't have 20 minutes of dramatic flair. "Your Honor," I started, opening the binder and placing it on the podium. "Mr. Sterling has just given a very passionate defense of a contract that hasn't existed since 2023. Sterling scoffed loudly from his table. "Objection, Your Honor. The covenants are a matter of public record and run with the land." "Overruled, Mr. Sterling. Let him speak," the judge said, looking at me with renewed interest. "What do you mean the contract doesn't exist, Dave?" "I am referring to the North Carolina Real Property Marketable Title Act, Your Honor. Specifically, Chapter 47B of the General Statutes," I said, my voice steady and clear. "The Act explicitly states that restrictive covenants automatically expire 30 years from the date of recordation unless a notice of renewal is formally filed with the Register of Deeds." I paused for dramatic effect. I looked over at Brenda. The color was slowly starting to drain from her face. Whispering Pines was established, and its original covenants recorded on April 14th, 1993, I continued, holding up the first tabbed document from my binder. "I have provided a certified copy of that original recordation to the clerk. That means the 30-year expiration date was April 14th, 2023. I spent several hours at the Wake County Register of Deeds office. and I have sworn affidavits from the county clerk confirming that no renewal, extension, or amendment was ever filed by the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association prior to that date, or ever, for that matter. The courtroom went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Judge Harrison sat forward, adjusting her glasses. Are you telling me this HOA is 33 years old and they forgot to renew their CC&Rs? That is exactly what I am telling you, Your Honor, I said. As of 3 years ago, the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association lost all legal authority to enforce any restrictive covenants on my property, or any property in that subdivision. They are a defunct entity operating on the illusion of authority. My property is entirely unencumbered. I didn't need their permission to pour stamped concrete, and I certainly didn't need their permission to build a boom barrier on my own land to keep trespassers away. They are suing me based on a contract that evaporated under state law. I took a breath. Therefore, I motion for a complete dismissal of the plaintiff's lawsuit with prejudice, as they lack the legal standing to enforce expired covenants. Judge Harrison looked at me, then looked at the documents the clerk handed up to her. She flipped through them, reading the MRTA statute, checking the dates on the original recordation, and verifying the affidavit from the county clerk. She looked up, and slowly turned her gaze to Mr. Sterling. Mr. Sterling, Judge Harrison said, her voice dangerously quiet. Did you verify the active status of your client's restrictive covenants before filing this 50-page lawsuit in my court? Sterling was standing up now, but he looked like he was going to be sick. He was shuffling wildly through his own massive stack of folders. Your Honor, the association president assured me that all documentation was in order. It is standard practice to assume. Assume? Judge Harrison cut him off, her voice cracking like a whip. You charged this association how much money to file a lawsuit without checking the most basic fundamental element of property law in this state? The Marketable Title Act isn't some obscure loophole, Counselor. It's a foundational statute. Your Honor, if we could just have a brief recess, I can review the county records. Sterling stammered, sweat literally beading on his forehead. There will be no recess, the judge declared, slamming her hand flat on the bench. The defendant has provided certified county documents proving your covenants expired 3 years ago. Your client has absolutely no standing in this court. This entire lawsuit is frivolous. Brenda jumped out of her seat. But he built a toll booth. He's a menace. You can't just let him do this or say it. Ma'am, sit down and be quiet, the judge barked, pointing a gavel at Brenda. You have no authority. You are not a governed body anymore. If you step foot on this man's property again, he can have you arrested for trespassing, and I will personally sign the warrant. Judge Harrison took a deep breath, composing herself. She looked at me. Dave, your motion to dismiss is granted, with prejudice. This HOA cannot sue you for this again. Thank you, Your Honor, I said, perfectly calm. However, if it pleases the court, I am not quite finished. Sterling looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. The judge raised an eyebrow. Oh? What else is there? Your Honor, since I am here, and since the plaintiff has dragged me into court on entirely frivolous grounds, using funds collected illegally from a defunct association, I would like to file a verbal counterclaim, I said, opening my binder to the final tab. I am countersuing the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, and Brenda specifically in her capacity as the former president, for harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and the unauthorized collection of neighborhood dues under false pretenses over the past 3 years. The judge leaned back, a very faint smile playing on her lips. I'm listening. Brenda has been collecting thousands of dollars in dues from the residents of Whispering Pines since 2023, claiming she had the legal authority to do so. She used those illegally collected funds to hire Mr. Sterling to harass me with a baseless lawsuit. I am asking the court to order a full audit of the association's finances, force Brenda to personally reimburse the HOA for all legal fees spent on this charade, and mandate that she send a formal letter to every single resident in the neighborhood, informing them that the HOA is legally dissolved and they no longer have to pay her a single dime. Brenda let out a sound like a deflating balloon and collapsed back into her chair. She was shaking. Sterling was just staring at the floor, probably calculating how fast he could pack his briefcase and leave the building. Judge Harrison didn't even hesitate. "Counterclaim acknowledged and frankly highly appropriate," the judge ruled. "Mr. Sterling, you will advise your client that she is personally liable for your legal fees. The association funds are frozen pending a county audit. The plaintiff is ordered to draft a letter of dissolution to the entire neighborhood within 7 days. If I find out you have collected one more penny from those people, ma'am, you will be facing criminal fraud charges." She banged the gavel. "Case dismissed. We are adjourned." I closed my binder. The sound was like a thunderclap in the quiet courtroom. I didn't gloat. I didn't say a word to Brenda or her expensive lawyer. I just picked up my binder, walked down the aisle, and pushed through the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom. Honestly, the fallout was spectacular. Within a week, Brenda's mandated letter went out to the neighborhood. The Whispering Pines Homeowners Association imploded overnight. Once people realized they were free, the absolute chaos that Brenda feared actually happened, but in the best way. Mrs. Gable painted her front door a vibrant, cheerful teal. The guy named Frank built a massive, unapproved shed in his backyard. Someone 3 streets over parked a vintage RV right in their driveway and left it there. It was glorious. Brenda was forced to resign in absolute disgrace. She had to take out a second mortgage on her house just to pay Sterling's legal fees, since the judge ruled she couldn't use the neighborhood funds to fight a personal vendetta. She stopped walking around the neighborhood with her clipboard. In fact, she rarely left her house at all. As for me, I went home. I called Mike the contractor. I paid him another $500 to come over and completely uninstall the toll booth and the boom barrier. I didn't need border security anymore. The dictator had been deposed. The country was free. But I kept the yellow line. I kept the yellow line painted across the driveway, right where the stamped concrete met the asphalt. It was a monument, a reminder. Every evening, when the sun started to set, I would drag a lawn chair out onto my glorious, unapproved charcoal slate driveway. I would crack open a cold beer, sit right behind that yellow line, and just watch the neighborhood exist in peace. No measuring tapes, no fines, no clipboards. Just absolute, unencumbered sovereignty. I guess the moral of the story is pretty simple. Never underestimate the sheer, destructive power of a guy who really, really likes his driveway and has enough spite to read 90 pages of county property records at midnight.